Good morning. We are without sound for a moment. No, we're not. We have wizards back at the mixing board there. We are, as I've said before, we have tried to use this space over the fall to provide an education component to many of the other things that are happening at the cathedral. That meant that the series on Fully Alive has kind of been a stop and start program. But I think that's okay because each of those classes stands on its own. But for the next couple of Sundays, we're going to return to discussing Elizabeth Oldfield's take on the 7 deadly sins in her book, Fully Alive. So this morning, I'm going to provide a brief context for what Oldfield is trying to do, give you a quick summary of the chapter that she has written on acedia, and then I'm going to riff on what she said a bit because I think she touched on something very important, but I want to go a little bit deeper than she did in describing that thing, and then I'll offer you a practice at the end. So we'll start the way we do and say this prayer together. Oh God, we rejoice that this time we share together is set within the deeper context of your presence, your purpose, and your power. We want to open ourselves to whatever you want to do with us. Open us up at the deeper levels of our beings that we might be aware of the touches of your grace upon our lives, that we may be responsive and receptive to whatever it is you want us to do. Amen. Thank you. I love starting off praying together, and as you know, each class I've written a prayer that I think touches upon the themes that we're going to discuss during that class. So, a little context on Elizabeth Oldfield. She is the former director of a think tank called Theos, which is based in London. It addresses things about faith, and she got fascinated with the idea of the sacred. So she started a podcast called The Sacred, which I've recommended to you before, in part because her task in this book and in much of her podcast is to have conversations with people with whom she does not agree. Let me say that again. To have conversations with people with whom she does not agree. Sometimes this is easy, they're mutually curious, and it's easy to listen to. Sometimes it's not. Like when she had Richard Hitchens' brother on, who's a particularly committed person to his atheist views. But the way she does that is fascinating, and so I recommend the podcast to you simply to watch how she goes about those conversations. There's a lot to be learned there. But in her book, she addresses the question, what do we do with our souls in turbulent times? When I started this in the fall, I thought, well, the election will be a turbulent time, and I predicted that it would continue to be turbulent into the first quarter, and so far, so good. I think we're still in need of tending to our souls. So what Elizabeth Oldfield says, playing on the Irenaeus quote from the 4th century, the glory of God is a human being fully alive. The glory of God is a human being fully alive. She says that fully alive is to live a life rich in gratitude, humility, connection, and community. Fully alive, to be fully ourselves, to have God fully expressed in us and through us, is to live a life rich with gratitude, humility, connection, and community. Those of you who attend this class on a regular basis know that I agree with her, and that's pretty much all I ever say. You've heard the joke of the 2 preacher's kids. One says, my mom is amazing. She can take any passage and preach 10 different sermons. And the other says, my dad's better than that. He can take 10 different passages and preach the same sermon. Well, this is my sermon, and I'm pretty much preaching it no matter what we are talking about. All right. as a result of that context, she, I think, perhaps predictably, defines sin as everything that works against connection. Sin, the obstacles to being in relationship with another person. The stumbling blocks that prohibit communion. That's what sin, not just moral failings, not something that we have done wrong necessarily, but things that get in the way of our being in relationship with each other, with God and with each other. I take the position that summary of the law, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself, are basically the same thing. That you can't do one without the other. That while we translate it in the prayer book as the first commandment and the second is like unto it, it could be translated as, and another way of saying this is. You with me? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. Another way of saying this is love your neighbor as yourself. You can't love God without loving your neighbor. You can't love your neighbor fully without loving God. That's part of the one sermon that I preach no matter what. All right, this idea of sin is not just hers. Somebody like Brother David Stendhal Rast, whom we've talked about before because of his emphasis on gratitude, says essentially the same thing. He says that what other ages have called sin, we call alienation. What other ages have called sin, we call alienation. See the resonance with Elizabeth Oldfield's definition, right? Sin is that thing that separates us from God and separates us from other people. An action, David Stendhal Rast says, is sinful to the degree to which it causes alienation. The contemporary term for salvation is belonging. The contemporary term for salvation is belonging. When Jesus says, we say Jesus has come to forgive us all of our sins, that's true. It is also true that redemption is to bring back into relationship with God and relationship with each other. All right, so then Elizabeth Oldfield takes the old idea of the 7 deadly sins. Now this, as we've discussed, began with Evagrius back in the 4th century. He had something called 8 bad thoughts. This is kind of Eastern spirituality out of the Eastern Christian church. And that has come down from us and in the Middle Ages got rewritten as the 7 deadly sins. And while in the West, we tend to think of those things as moral failures. Again, you can see that definition of sin. In the East, they were always kind of spiritual directives. They were always better ways to be. They were there so to help us identify those things that kept us out of relationship. Oldfield has taken the 7 deadly sins as we have them in the West and looked at them not only for their definitions, but also for the movement into relationship that they signify. You with me? So it's not just say, here's wrath, that's anger. We know not to be mad at each other because God doesn't like it. And she said wrath is what keeps you from relationship. So how do we deal with that? We move from polarization to peacemaking. That's how she structured this whole book. So today, we're going to look at acedia, the ancient term acedia, which she characterizes as being on that spectrum from distraction to attention. Distraction to attention. And then, as you can see, there are others, and we'll go through them in turn, not today, but in coming sessions. So the idea is to try to give you something to work with in your own spiritual growth. Not just to have something to think about so you know what's wrong, but to have something to work with so you can grow closer to God through the practices that are suggested by these thoughts and through the awareness that we are on spectrum from out of relationship to being in relationship, and the ability to see when we're out and why is helpful to our returning to relationship. So Oldfield's conceptual framework is, and I quote her here, I don't want to get distracted by ambition and being impressive. I want the focus of my life to be relationships. Now, she comes to this awareness by virtue of a skiing accident. Oldfield's not the greatest athlete that ever walked, and her first time out on the slopes resulted in a pretty profound injury, which forced her to move home and live in a wheelchair for a long period of time. She said her parents were of the age where a lot of their friends were dying. Some of you know this age. It's not altogether a happy one, but because she couldn't care for herself, she wound up going to a lot of funerals. And she said David Brooks is right when he talks about resume virtues and eulogy virtues. She noticed in funeral after funeral after funeral, people were not talking about achievements or accomplishments or what they owned or even what other people said about them in terms of their vocational success, right? Those are resume virtues. Instead, people were talking about how they were loved by this person, seen by this person, cared for by this person. And after she heard one eulogy after another, she concluded, reasonably, I think, I want to be like that, right? I do want to be buried in St. Paul's Cathedral, which is packed by all the people who love me. But what I want them to say about me is they're there because I cared, I saw, I loved. And so out of that, she changes her life. But fundamentally, it's about not being distracted by ambition and being impressive, but instead to be focused on relationships. So acedia. Acedia, which is probably not a word you've heard much, sounds like something in an orange or some other fruit maybe, I don't know. But it's actually a word that we often translate as sloth, right? We don't translate that Latin term acedia anymore. We translate it primarily as sloth. And when I say sloth, I bet an image immediately comes to mind, which is no longer appropriate, so you don't have to describe it. But nevertheless, it's fundamentally about laziness, right? About the absence of discipline, not caring for yourself, not having any commitment to getting better, whatever. But that's really not right, I think. It's not laziness. It's more like listlessness, distraction, apathy, restlessness, just the inability to kind of stay committed to something or even focus on it. Now, in the past, i.e. before iPhones, we would have thought of this as associated with depression or feeling down. You know, I just can't quite get out of bed. I just can't quite find the energy to move forward. But I think, and Oldfield notes, we have a new level of distraction now, right? Which is always with us. I was thinking recently, if somebody came up to me and pointed a gun at my head and said, your wallet or your phone, I would hand them my wallet in a minute, right? It's like my entire life is on this phone. I wouldn't even know what to do. I wouldn't know I was me if I didn't have two-factor authentication. Anyway, so acedia then sets us up for looking at the distraction in our lives. And Oldfield says, and I think, again, insightfully, you know, the opposite of distraction is attention, not just focus, not just awareness in a broad sense, but attention. The ability to discern the most important thing and then stay focused on it. The ability to discern the most important thing and stay focused on it. Some of you are thinking about Billy Crystal in a cowboy movie. We're not going there. But I do want you to see how distraction is a problem. So to illustrate that, I want to go to the Bible of all spiritual authority, Harry Potter. I mean, one day we're going to do a series on Harry Potter. It really is a very rich and spiritually sophisticated tale. Well, this is an enchanted mirror, which is protecting something called the Sorcerer's Stone. If you get the Sorcerer's Stone, you live forever. There's an evil figure called Voldemort, whose name shall not be pronounced. or spoken. And he is wanting the stone because he wants to live forever, but he's kind of the incarnate of evil. And then we have our protagonist, Harry Potter, who ultimately is preventing the success of evil. He's kind of the figure for good here. So Potter is warned by his spiritual mentor, Dumbledore, that men have wasted away before it, that is, this mirror, entranced by what they have seen and been driven mad, not knowing if what it shows is real or even possible. Now, when you're reading Harry Potter's books or you're watching the movie, this is, you're in the mode of fantasy. But when you extract this sentence, you're like, oh my goodness, yeah. That's just like looking at the phone, right? Maybe Carolina actually won that game by more points if I just look again. So what happens is Harry Potter runs into this mirror. This is a depiction of the first time he sees himself in it. The mirror lets you see what you desire most deeply. So what he sees is the parents who died when he was a very young child. That's what he desires most deeply. One of the other characters sees himself as head boy and championship of the Quidditch team and all the things his brothers had accomplished at their school, which he had not, right? And so, of course, the evil one wants eternal life for himself. So he's never going to get the Sorcerer's Stone because what he's going to see as his deepest desire actually prevents him from getting what he wants. You remember I've often said what I most want is to be fully known and fully loved. But because I don't think you would love me if you fully knew me, I instead present this curated self to you, which means even if you love me, I don't get what I want. Does that make sense? So I am standing in my own way. Maybe somebody else has a sense of that. That's what this mirror does. And I think that's what we do in our lives. We are distracted by the promise of the fulfillment of some image of ourselves which we think we desire, but really isn't God, and it really isn't our truest self. Can you see that? How this kind of gives us an image for something we experience in life. Harry Potter ultimately, of course, finds that his deepest desire is to keep the Sorcerer's Stone from the evil one, and it magically appears in his pocket. You with me? The moment, translated for our purposes, that it is God he desires and not his own, the satisfaction of his own selfish ego wishes, he gets what he wants, even though he didn't really know what was going to happen. All right, so distraction. That's the kind of distraction I'm talking about, and I hope an illustration of how it works perniciously in our lives to keep us from drawing closer to God as we're constantly drawing closer to the images of what we think we want that will make us happy or fully alive. And Oldfield's contention, and I think Jesus' contention, is that it won't make you fully alive. Remember, you got to lose your life to save it. Remember that phrase? But it's a big deal now. Do you know who these guys are? Right? This is Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and Elon Musk, right? Fondly known as the attention merchants. Who was it that was sitting next to Trump at the inauguration? Who is it that we see time and time again? I mean, Elon Musk paid $44 billion for Twitter, which seemed absurd, but now he's commanding attention all over the world. Maybe he knew what he was doing. Ezra Klein published an opinion in the New York Times this morning that said, really, the key thing in politics now is attention, not money. Money is only valuable to the extent it can get you attention. You with me? So look at the national race, and regardless of your politics, just look at the dynamics of those politics, and attention seems to rule, right? Again, it's just a manifestation of what I'm talking about with distraction. The purpose, hang on lines, the purpose is for social media platforms, right, is to attract your attention and hold on to it as long as they can. Because they make money not by your subscription fee often, but by advertising. Yes, Lance. Oh, Lions, the other read of that was I was afraid you were distracted, and I wanted you back. You may. Yeah. So we used to have a priest here, a wonderful priest. His name was Elizabeth Rector. She went on to become a rector of a church that we finally refer to as Rector. Her definition of hell was getting everything you want and still not being happy. So yes, you're walking a familiar path. And I would say you've also analyzed it correctly. Really, what we think we want is just assuaging our ego, and if we get it all, we're still left with our ego, which is really not our deepest need. There's something, to get back to David Boyd's excellent sermon this morning, there may be food on the table and presents at Christmas, and something is still missing. Right? So thank you. I think that's perfect. All right. Well, so then Elizabeth Oldfield, she goes through a lot of stories about trying to separate herself from her devices and taking a Sabbath and being unable to do so, all things that I think we are familiar with. And she comes to the conclusion that training attention, remember I said the solution to distraction is discerning the most important thing and then focusing on it with some commitment. She comes to the conclusion that training attention, structuring time are the hidden genius of religions. The hidden genius of religions, which I actually think is true. So I've given you this image of a trellis because that's an image typically used to describe a rule of life. Do you know what a rule of life is? Like St. Benedict's rule? A rule of life that establishes a rhythm, not just a bunch of stuff you're going to do. It's not New Year's resolutions. It's instead a rhythm of life. And it may involve what you eat and how you pray and exercise you get and how you treat other people. And the first time you try to create one, if you're like me, it's impossible to get through a single day of doing everything you thought you should do. And if you do, you don't even want to get up tomorrow because you just got to do it all over again. But if you work with it over time, if you have some simple things, you can find that, let's say you decide, well, one of the rhythms, one of the things I would like to do in my life is to read other people charitably. What does that mean? That means no matter how stupid whatever they said is, you're still going to try to find 3 explanations for why it's reasonable. And what number are you on now? Yeah, so the point, or Elizabeth Oldfield talks about she's a Jewish woman that attended Harvard Divinity School, is now an atheist. I think that makes her an Episcopalian, but I don't know. So what she says is her rhythm of life included trying to read charitably. Read charitably. What does that mean? That means don't rip through a book just looking for information. Have you ever done that? It's called instrumentalizing the text. I'm just ripping through this book because I know that it's going to teach me how to find trout, and I just want to learn how to find trout. And so you're halfway through the book, you're flipping to the end to try to figure out how long is this going to take, right? That's instrumentalizing the text. Some of us do it to the Bible, right? I'm reading through the Bible. It's going to teach me how to live, what not to do. God, there's a lot in here. To read charitably is to be in relationship with the text. It's to read it as if it has a gift to offer you. To read the text, whether it's the Bible or your life or another person, as if it has a gift to offer you. If you can put yourself into that rhythm, then you're going to be able to sit with that text. You're going to be able to enjoy that text. You're not going to read as many books. You won't need to read as many books. Maybe Faulkner. Maybe you ought to read all of Faulkner. Maybe Middlemarch once. I don't know. But I encourage you to think about this. How do you go through life looking at every experience, every text, every person, every service as if it has a gift to offer you? When I was in seminary, we were at Wesley, whatever, it's a assisted living facility. I forgot the name of it. Wesley Woods, thank you. And the chaplain, Nancy Baxter, who was in charge of us, assigned each of us to a resident there. And our task really was to go up and get them out of their rooms and get them down to service. That took about 30 minutes, but that's what we were to do. And what Nancy said to us is, I have assigned each of you to somebody because you have something in common with them. And your task is to figure out what that is. I was halfway through the semester before I realized she had completely randomly assigned us. But we're all, looking. What is it? What is it? And what we saw is a gift that was given to us. She tricked us into seeing the person that we were highly likely to treat as an object, right? Not to be in relationship with them, but to perform a function to, or if you're really being good, with them. See the difference? I'm here to get you fully dressed, tolerate the smell, and get you downstairs. As opposed to, who are you? How can I see you? How am I really committed to being with you? Those are very different stances to a person. And I walked out of that experience convicted, of course, because I'm walking through life all the time figuring out how to be helpful to somebody or extract what I need from them. We all do that. And how is life different if your purpose is to be in relationship with them? Because there's a gift to be given to you by them. And I would go as far as to say, a gift you need, right? A gift you need. I don't need to find trout. Clay can do that for me. Right? Okay. Attention. Yes. No. Yes, all that is true in the reciprocity of the relationship, but what I think motivates you is not to give, but to receive. I know that's contrary to all the aphorisms we grew up with. And I'm not saying giving and receiving isn't part of the reciprocity of a true relationship. I am saying that I think what we as a culture are fighting is when we give, we are putting ourselves in a superior position. It's a power-up task. Does that make sense? So, yes, I would like to be a gift to others, but I think that culturally our challenge is we don't know how to receive. We don't know how to receive. First time I ever did a Maundy Thursday foot washing service. I was all into it. I got the water out, I got the towels out, I washed more feet. Everybody's feet were chafed by the time I was through washing. And I finished the entire service and I realized, you know what I didn't do? I didn't take my shoes off. I didn't take my socks off. I did not let my feet get washed. I was more than comfortable giving, but not so comfortable receiving. Now, my first Maundy Thursday here, I preached that in a sermon. The dean made a beeline for me when we started washing feet, so we got rid of this reluctance right away. But so yes, there's a reciprocal relationship, but I want you to focus on receiving the gift because that's what slows you down. So, all right, here is where I want to deviate a little bit from Oldfield, because what Oldfield does when we get to attention is she kind of tells us about her life, her rule of life. You know, she lives with another couple in a communal setting, and they say prayer 3 times a week and have dinner once a week, and all these elements of their rule of life, which draw them closer to God and help them deal with themselves. And it's all good, but I want to look at that differently. And so I'm moving to a guy named Robert Mulholland, whose book, Invitation to a Journey, is the best book on spiritual formation I've ever read. If you have to read one, and I'm saying this despite the fact that he's a Methodist. But it is simple, it is accessible, and the bookstore's going to kill me because I didn't tell them I was going to say this, but it is the best book on spiritual development I think I've ever read. And what he says is, when we get into these spiritual practices, there's a tremendous tension. There's a tremendous tension. And the tension is, without doing these things, God can't deal with us. Now, the way he says it's more eloquent. Without our performance of the disciplines, God is, for all practical purposes, left without any means of grace through which to effect transformation in our lives. I would translate that by saying, if we don't still ourselves and open ourselves to God, we will never experience God's presence. So there's work we have to do. We have to open ourselves to the presence of God before that gift will ever be given. Having received the gift, we can give other gifts. Does that make sense? But here's the tension. And this is why I want to deviate from Elizabeth Oldfield a little bit, because the challenge there is you start to make it look like something you're doing. When you finish your rule of life that I described before as being so comprehensive, it looks like a workout plan, right? So I cut out sugar, I don't drink any more alcohol, no prepared foods, work out 18 times a day, half of them outside, do that for about 9 months, and I'm going to be hard body. That's all something we're doing. That's the true meaning of works righteousness, right? And we, I believe, cannot draw closer to God on our own merit. So there's something we have to do, but the minute we get really committed to doing it, then we start to think it's us making it happen, which is right back to the distraction we were trying to avoid. You have to surrender to the grace of God to experience the transformation that Jesus promises. Again, Mulholland says it a bit more eloquently, but without God's transforming grace, our disciplines are empty, hollow motions, empty, hollow motions, the form of godliness without the power. The form of godliness without the power. So the main thing I want you to walk away from today with is there's work we need to do to open ourselves to the presence of God, and then we need to stop and accept the gift that we have been given and let it do its work in us. And I think for us, that is for me, but I think for us in this particular aspect of our culture, very difficult to do. Lions. Thank you. Yes, yes. Lyons loves to quote me back to myself because he knows how much I love it. Thank you. He's just testing me. No, Psalm 46, verse 10. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. Some of you know that in Christian contemplative practice yields a prayer practice where you say the whole phrase, be still and know that I am God, and then you drop a word. Be still and know that I am, be still and know that I. You're down to just be, and then you build it back again, right? And if we had time, we'd do it, but if you do it with pace, it's amazing to feel it actually happening. So thank you, Lyons. I think that's a very good point. So there are we're going to get back to this when we talk about prayer. All right, so this tension, you got the tension, there's stuff you got to do, but it ain't up to you. That's a Southern translation of this eloquent thing. So there are three inner dynamics that I want to go through quickly: silence, solitude, and prayer. Silence, solitude, and prayer. Mulholland talks about this. Oldfield doesn't, but it is the operative dynamic in what Oldfield does describe. Silence is not just being quiet, right? Silence is a deep inner reversal of the powerful tendency in our culture to objectify everything and everyone around us, to make them objects that are to be arranged within our ordering of the world. I read these through for the podcast. I appreciate you can read it off the board. But hopefully you'll see that this is exactly what I've been trying to say, right? That stilling ourselves, going into silence, by the way, that be still in Psalm 46 could be translated as be quiet. It is an invitation to silence. That silence has a way of stopping us from thinking. That's really what centering prayer and many other meditation practices are about. Or to get more specific, to stop your left brain from running everything so that your right brain can kick in. Or, in the language of spirituality and contemplative practice, to have your head drop into your heart. You know, you hear people say, maybe you didn't, but I heard a lot of people say, get out of your head. No, don't get out of your head. Let your head drop into your heart. It's the integration of both that is your objective. Not just to feel without thinking, not to think without feeling. So the way the contemplative Christianity has talked about that is let your head drop into your heart. The beginning of that in almost any prayer practice or method, I'm agnostic as to method, but if you look at them, almost all the methods start with silence. And silence then leads to solitude. So solitude, in the silence of release, is beginning to face the deep inner dynamics of our being that make us that grasping, controlling, manipulative person, beginning to face God at those points. Beginning to face God at those points. So first thing is be silent, stop thinking. Second thing is turn and look at yourself, honestly, which takes some courage typically. And what do you see? And just the seeing of it will help you deal with it, because invariably that's not who you want to be. And invariably you have somehow protected yourself against seeing that before. So this is one of the great benefits of being married, partnered, or having really close friends. Somebody that you trust enough to see you and tell you what they see without threatening the relationship, right? That's when you know you've got a true friend, somebody who can tell you what they see, and the whole time they're talking, you never feel like your relationship is threatened. All right, solitude. If you go to silence, it leads you to solitude. And if I had more time, I would tell you the story of Jacob. Do you remember? I'm going to give you the outlines of the story, but I had a whole long telling of it I'm going to have to forego. Jacob, you'll remember, goes down to get a wife. He runs into his father-in-law Laban, but you remember how Jacob, of course, steals his father's birthright, right? He steals it from his brother, and then he tricks his father, and he's the manipulator, right? He's the one who supplants. That's what Jacob means. So he gets sent down by his mother, and to find his wife, what happens? He runs into somebody who's equal to his wit, and he gets tricked by his father-in-law. First he has to take their older sister as his wife. Then he finally gets the wife. Then he tricks his father-in-law, so he gets all the best parts of the herd. Then he has to run. Finally, his father-in-law catches him, and he builds a wall. They build a wall, remember? He said, you stay on your side of the wall, I'll stay on my side of the wall, and we'll be fine. Anybody who crosses dies, in essence. Kind of a precursor to Robert Frost, I suppose. So he goes back home with his wives and his herds, a rich man, and Esau, the brother he tricked, comes out to meet him with an army. Not an army of well-wishers. So Jacob then takes his wives and his herds and puts them between him and his threatening brother, as if to say, I'm going to take all that I have to protect me from what might be my fate. And there, behind, he encounters God. They wrestle in the night. What does God do? He asks him who he is. Well, God knows who he is. Why is God asking him that question? And Jacob says, I am Jacob. I am the manipulator. I am the supplanter. What has he done? In the silence created by the putting all of his life out in front of him, He encounters God who leads him into solitude, i.e., look at the part of you that is operating here. And it turns out to be a dark side, right? But in naming it, in Jacob naming it in himself, he is transformed. So there's work for him to do, but ultimately he's making himself vulnerable to the transformative power of God's grace. And then out of that, he comes out a different person. He's, I'm going to go face my fate, whatever it is. All right. So there's a sequence here is what I'm claiming. Silence, solitude, prayer. Silence, we let go of our manipulative control. And if you feel like I've hit that a little too hard, just stay with me for a while. Because I've tried to say this very same thing about 5 or 6 different ways. And sometimes your defensive mechanisms will push that apart, but just, I want to say it's natural. I've described it as problematic, and it is, but it's natural because what? I mean, we're us, and we would look out in the world. Who's in the middle of the world? We are. We just are. And so this is something we've all got to wrestle with. That leads you to solitude, face up to the depths of who you are, and that leads you to prayer where you offer yourself to God. And it is that sequence which I want you to think about. Henry Nouwen describes that sequence wonderfully, as he almost always does. Prayer is such a radical act because it requires us to criticize our whole way of being in the world, to lay down our old selves and accept our new self, which is Christ. Prayer, therefore, is the act of dying to all that we consider to be our own and of being born to a new existence which is not of this world. You see, I think, this dying and resurrection pattern. But now not just in the context of there being an afterlife, but in the promise that there being eternal life here and now. How do we access it? Silence, solitude, and prayer. All of the methods of prayer, all of the rules of life, all the rhythms that we may create to draw ourselves closer to God are fundamentally driven by these inner dynamics, I think. Silence, solitude, and prayer. So we don't have time for you to respond now unless you just have to, but what I wanted to get you to think about is, can you think of a time when you gave yourself to God in prayers, as Nouwen describes? But if you can get that, and so I do want you to think, without having to share, I want you to think about a time when you've given yourself to God, as Nouwen describes. I can think of 2 moments. One, when I was sick in the hospital, threatened with blindness, not knowing what would happen, doped up on a bunch of drugs. Not hard to see that. It's just overwhelming. You're like, all right, I quit. Not I quit like I want to die, but I quit like whatever. But I also experienced that when my first child was born. And it was so wonderful, so overwhelming, so obviously not of my doing. And yet, I get it, that I had a similar experience, right? Of just being overwhelmed by the presence of God and willingly giving myself over to it. It's like, please let me raise this child to be herself. Not what I want her to be. And she made sure that I made good on that prayer. Right? Not what I want her to be, but who God wants her to be. So this notion of silence and solitude leading to prayer, my point is it can come when you're in great distress and you're overwhelmed and you have to give up because it's obvious you're not in control. But it can also come in the wonderful parts of life where you are given great gifts and it's clear you don't deserve them. Right? Both are moments where you can experience the presence of God. And my plea, or not my plea, but my argument here is that through practice, through spiritual practice, through a rhythm of life, we can learn to experience those moments more frequently. Because we don't have to be in the extremes to recognize them, right? Once we recognize what the presence of God looks and feels like, or surrender once or twice without, losing everything, then we get a little bit of courage, a little bit of confidence. We trust God a little bit more, and we can engage in those practices a little bit more effectively. Knowing that we have to work hard, but it's really not us, but trusting that that gift will be given. All of this is just about gaining a level of trust that in our surrender, that gift will be given. All right. So, I'm going to let you go on time, but I want to suggest a practice for you this week. It's not easy, but set aside 10 if you want to do it. I'm not saying it's homework. I'm saying you might think about, as you establish a rhythm in your life, to set aside 10 minutes, doesn't matter when it is. Sit in a chair and straighten your back and put your feet on the floor. Posture is important. Take 3 breaths, each time saying, Lord, free me from care for myself. Lord, free me from care for myself. After you've done that 3 times, just pay attention to where you're holding yourself tight. If you're paying attention, you will literally feel a physical manifestation associated with where you're not free. You may feel it in the tension in your stomach. You may feel it in your shoulders, which are rising up a little bit more than they should. You may feel it because you've forgotten where your feet are and you have to find them again. Notice how breathing and saying the words helps you to let go. In the Buddhist meditation traditions, they talk about breathing into these places of tightness. I'm just talking about starting by noticing them, right? But by being enough in your body, not just thinking about things, but being enough in your body, you notice the signals that it's sending. This is silence becoming solitude. Name yourself as honestly as you can, as Jacob did. Who are you in this moment? Offer yourself to God in prayer. Close by saying Psalm 131. You can ignore that because I'm not going to have time to talk about it. But what I'm trying to do is give you a 10-minute practice where you can implement these inner dynamics of silence, solitude, and prayer. It's very simple. If you want this slide, just email me. I'll send it to you. Many of you probably have in the past done various prayer methods or practices that utilize this. But here's the key. You can't just think about it. You can't just understand that it makes sense. You have to do it, right? You have to do it. So, posture is important. Silence. Lord, free me from care for myself. Solitude. Where is my body tightening or holding tension? Naming yourself. Who am I in this moment? And then offering yourself to God in prayer. If you have questions, you can email me. All right. I want you to stand as we close, and we'll say this version of the Lord's Prayer together. Dear Father, always be near us. May your name be treasured and loved. May your rule be completed in us. May your will be done here on earth in just the way it is done in heaven. Give us today the things we need today, and forgive us our sins and impositions on you as we are forgiving all who in any way offend us. Please don't put us through trials, but deliver us from everything bad, because you are the one in charge, and you have all the power, and the glory too is all yours forever, which is just the way we want it. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.